Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm Jack Caldwell, and what I'm here to talk to you today is about this weird thing that I've invented, and that is my Jane Austen's Fighting Men universe. So we're going to get this thing up and running, and we're going to see if this pops up. And yes, we should be going here. So let's see here. Move things around here. Where are we? Here we are. There we go. And there we are. So we're going to talk about Jane Austen's Fighting Men universe. And let's go explain exactly what the heck the Jane Austen's Fighting Men universe is all about. Well, about 10 years ago, I came up with this crazy idea. And it's based on two assumptions. First, all of Jane Austen's novels are set around the year they were published. They were published. So that means Sense and Sensibility is around 1810, 1811, Pride and Prejudice 1811, 1812, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because that's important because then I simply assumed that all Jane Austen's characters knew each other. So when you have the Darcys dealing with the Brandons, who are dealing with the Knightleys, this opens up the entire universe of Jane Austen. And it's really helpful when you're writing sequels, which has been one of my the things that I really like to do. So let's take a look at how I set up this universe. And the way I did that is like with everything else, we have to start with our power couple. It's going to be Darcy and Elizabeth. I mean, they're it. Everything revolves around them. And so that's where this whole thing starts. The solid bar between them shows that they're married. So when you see that in some of the other slides, you'll know what the heck I'm doing here. So these are the characters I pulled out of Jane Austen's universe from the Pride and Prejudice. And so you'll see a lot of them. You'll have Wickham and Lydia are married. And of course, Darcy and Elizabeth. You also have some of my original characters, like my Dark Darcy, which is Sir John Beaufort. You also have Georgiana will eventually get married to this guy, which is Lord Llewellyn. Then you have Kitty married to the Reverend Sutherland, who happens to have the parish up there. And don't forget this guy right here, Thomas Tucker. He's going to be an important person in the universe. So this is where I got from Pride and Prejudice. So from there, I have to add in Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, Northanger Abbey, with a few folks from the Scarlet Pimpernel. We'll talk about that later. Persuasion, and Emma. Not too much from Emma, but there's reasons for that. So you can see they're all sitting there. Of course, there are family relations, which are defined by the red lines that you're looking at right now. There's very little crossover between the groups, except for one, where you'll see that Emma is related to Georgiana's eventual husband. There's a reason for that. Other than that, they're kind of sitting around their own little places in the world. But we all know that everyone's lives is a lot more complicated than that. There are business and political ties. And you'll see that most of them center around two people. One of them is going to be Mr. Gardner. He has become quite the successful tradesman, and he becomes very wealthy. And of course, a lot of people want to get involved with that. The other one is this guy, Tucker. He is an up-and-coming solicitor and very politically involved. So he is another center of the universe besides the Darcys. So you have that, but then you also have friendships. And so you can see this whole thing is turned into a virtual spider's webs of connections between people throughout the whole group there. So this is what holds this whole universe together. And of course, we have some cameos, usually of people like John Willoughby or John Thorpe, Henry Ponscombe Crawford, or her evilness herself, Lady Susan. So they pop in and out of the novels, and it's a lot of fun. And as Maria just said about having a story Bible, this is my story Bible. So the novels in the Jane Austen Fighting Men series right now are The Three Colonels, The Last Adventure of the Scarlet Pimpernel, and my latest is just out, Persuaded to Sail. I also have two more that are going to be coming out later on this year. Is going to be the grand sequel, which is Rosings Park, and then it's going to be a fifth novel. It's going to slide right on in there sometime next year. I'm writing it right now, which is called Brother of the Bride, and we'll talk a little bit more about those later. So the first three books of the series are not a true series. They're what I call companion novels. And I define a companion novel as one that's going to have actions that happen in the same time over multiple books. So everything's happening at the same time, but they just have different characters, different plots, and yet they have some characters in common. There's threads that tie the books together. So while it's not truly a series, and each book stands on its own, it's a heck of a lot more fun when you read them all and you can see the interactions between the characters. So the way Jane Austen's Fighting Men series is a series of companion novels. It has those three books. They're all set during the same time, during a very important time during the Regency, which is the 100 Days Crisis of 1815. Now, several of the characters do know each other, have interactions with each other, but what they do is they take place at different times during this event. One is going to take place in Waterloo. The other one is going to be an espionage novel set in Paris. And the third, of course, if you're dealing with persuasion, is going to take place at the high seas. Now, you have to understand that I come to Austen with my love of history. And so there's a great deal of historical context in these novels. And so I picked a particular part of the Regency because it's very, very interesting. I call it the late Regency, which is between 1814 and 1819. And there's a lot of stuff that was going on during this time period. Two of the most important that affected that and affects us today is this 100 Days Crisis I keep talking about and the Industrial Revolution. For those of you who are not quite familiar with the Regency, let me run it really quickly. The Regency really ran from 1811 to 1820, when George III was declared by Parliament to be insane, unable to carry on his duties, and they set up his son, the Prince of Wales, who would become the regent, effectively the king in all but name. So we're talking about the later period of that. Now, those two events, for those of you who are not, since I keep talking about the 100 Days Crisis, let me explain what that is. The 100 Days Crisis is actually 111 days that takes place beginning on February 28th and ends around June 22nd of 1815. Those dates are the date that Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the Emperor of the French, who had been defeated in 1814 and had been sent to Elba as a prisoner in exile, escaped and returned to France. June 22nd is when, after his tremendous defeats, he abdicated the throne for the second and final time. The key period that happened there was the Battle of Waterloo. And the reason that happened was that when Napoleon escaped, it basically threw the entire continent of Europe back into war. They were all meeting at the Congress of Vienna to figure out how we're going to handle the peace. Well, here it is, the so-called destroyer of mankind is running rampant again, so we got to call up our armies again. This really put Britain into a really, really tough situation because most of their best troops were over in North America, either in Canada or dead in Louisiana. So they had to scratch up whatever they could, Wellington's infamous army, and with the Dutch and with the Prussians, met Napoleon in Belgium, and that was the Battle of Waterloo. And that happened on June 18th. And it's only a few weeks later that Napoleon was forced to abdicate. He would eventually surrender to the British about a month later. But why this is a key point is that when all the dust was settled after this event, Britain became the preeminent military and naval power in the world for the next 100 years. Pax Britannica began now, and they spread the British influence basically covered the entire globe because of what happened at Waterloo. The second great event that happened during this time period is the Industrial Revolution. Now, generally, it's assumed that this began around 1760, 1718. It definitely began in Great Britain. And people didn't realize it was going on until about 1830, but it was going on. And so when you hear about all the troubles with the Luddites and all the other revolts that were going on in Britain, this began with the textiles. And when they figured out they could make machines that were powered by water or by wind, and eventually would be powered by steam, that could make cloth with better quality at a cheaper price than you could with farmers' wives who were sitting in their parlors, basically weaving to generate extra income for their families when, from instead of just selling crops. So you had two things that were going on. With the new factories, you had young men who were leaving the farms to go work into these factories to actually be paid cash instead of having to live off the farm, and you live by, that you're lucky to have 2 meals a day. But you also were taking money away from these farmers up in the north because no one's buying their cloth anymore. No one's buying their wool anymore. They're buying it from these great factories. Of course, there were revolts. Of course, there were people who were upset about that, but you had the inevitability of progress. And again, this started out with with textiles, and eventually steam. With the invention of the safety lantern, you had a lot more dealing with coal. And because of that, you could more easily work iron. You can see how each invention built on the other that basically changed the world. Not only did it build the British Empire, but economic historians are in agreement that the onset of the Industrial Revolution is the most important event in the history of humanity since the domestication of animals and plants. As a Catholic, I would put in another event as well, the birth of Jesus Christ. But whether you buy that or not, it is something that you have to sit there and think about. Before then, most people in the world lived on what they could generate with their own hands. After the Industrial Revolution, you basically created capitalism. You basically created the world we all live in today. We are still living in the Industrial Revolution. That's how big a deal this is, and that's why it was so upsetting to what used to be England's green and pleasant land was now an industrial powerhouse. So we're going to talk a little bit about my 3 novels here, which are the 3 Colonels of The Scarlet Pimpernel and Persuaded to Sail, are those 3 novels that we talked about in the okay, let me stop the share here. And so that's where we are at right now with the 3 novels, and that's the entire basis of the universe. So of the 3 books that we're starting out, I started out with the first one here, which is the 3 Colonels. Now, the three colonels is, let me read the blurb here on the back and kind of get started on that here. Okay. The worlds of Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility merge in this one-of-a-kind continuation of both beloved Jane Austen tales. Love reigns supreme for Colonels Beaufort, Fitzwilliam, and Brandon, as our brave fighting men are enjoying their courtships and early married lives with their beloved Austen heroines. The couples live tranquil lives until Napoleon escapes from exile. As the colonels set out to meet their destinies on the field of Waterloo, Anne, Caroline, and Marianne defend their hearts against the fear of losing their loved ones forever. From the serenity of Regency England to the scandal and intrigue of the Congress of Vienna, three gentlemen live, love, fight, and defend their country from Napoleon's voracious ambition. So that's the first book. This is my, if you would almost call it, my army book. And it also is a sequel to Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. We talk about what happened after those books were done. The second book in the series is this one, The Last Adventure of the Scarlet Pimpernel. This is my attempt at Swashbuckler, and it's also my sequel to Northanger Abbey. The worlds of Jane Austen and Baroness Orczy combined in the swashbuckling tale from the author of The Three Colonels. That's me. Captain Frederick Tilney, dashing cavalry officer and rakish heir to Northanger Abbey, is interested only in fencing and carousing. That is until he meets the girl of his dreams, the lovely and intriguing Violet Blakeney. However, her father is not convinced of Frederick's pledge to reform, and the officer is banished from Violet's presence. The baronet has a will of iron, for he is none other than Sir Percy Blakeney, the retired Scarlet Pimpernel. Now, during the 100 Days Crisis, an evil from the Pimpernel's past menaces the Blakeney family, while Sir Percy is crippled by age. Frederick must convince the baronet to accept his assistance in accomplishing the impossible, taking on an entire country to rescue the girl they both love. Any of you have ever read or seen any of the Pimpernel movies knows what type of character Sir Percy is. And I'll be honest with you, it was a lot of fun writing Sir Percy. Plus, it's something else I really enjoy doing is taking somebody and reforming them. In, The Three Colonels, I'm famous for reforming Caroline Bingley. In this book, I do the same with Captain Frederick Tilney. The third book in the series is, of course, the one that came out just recently. This is my sequel to Persuasion, Persuaded to Sail. This one takes place right after Persuasion ends. It begins with the wedding of Captain Frederick Wentworth to Anne Elliot. The long-awaited sequel to Jane Austen's final novel, Persuasion. After an 8-year separation and tumultuous reunion, Anne Elliot marries the dashing Captain Frederick Wentworth. The pair looks forward to an uneventful honeymoon cruise aboard the HMS Laconia. But the bride and groom find the seas of matrimony rough. Napoleon has escaped from Elba, the country is at war with France again, and the Admiralty imposes on Wentworth a mysterious passenger on a dangerous secret mission. The good captain is caught between duty to his country and love for his wife. All eyes are trained on a search for enemies without, but the greatest menace may already be on board. So that's the third book. So what we're going to, and we're going to follow that with 2 other novels. I'm writing that book right now. Well, actually, Rosings Park is done. It's going through editing, and it'll be released this fall. It's a sequel to the Three Colonels and explores the late Regency, the events that happened then. You had all these things that were going on, plus you had a volcano that blew up in the South Pacific in 1815, which causes tremendous loss of crops and livestock during the summer with the year without summer, which was 1816. Now, people don't understand what's going on, but they see the result of it, and that adds more unrest to Great Britain. But it also centers on the Fitzwilliams, especially Richard Fitzwilliam, now, since he's married to Anne de Burgh, he gets to try to run an estate for the first time. Doesn't really know how, but his pride won't let him go to the one guy who could teach him how to do it, which is going to be Darcy. Plus, you also follow up on the Bufords as well. Rosings Park was designed to be that final novel in the series. But thanks to a couple of people who know who they are, that's going to be Abigail and Maria, they convinced me to slide another book in there. And that's going to be the one I'm working on right now that will be released hopefully sometime next year. It's called Brother of the Bride. And this actually talks about the courtship, engagement, and wedding of Fitzwilliam Darcy's sister, Georgiana. Now, what makes this one fun is at the same time, the Darcys are going to be wards to one of Lydia's daughters. Yeah. Chloe. Elizabeth is pregnant with her second child, and yet Georgiana demanded that she's going to get married in September. So Darcy has to try to plan this wedding. He's going to get some help, all right, not only from his aunt, Lady Matlock, and because Llewellyn, her groom, is related, second cousins to Emma Knightley, she gets to show up. So you see, I finally get Emma into one of these books. Then you also have, of course, you can't have a wedding without having Mrs. Bennet involved, and of course, Lady Catherine must have her share of the conversation. So you can kind of imagine what kind of farce this book is going to be. So we're looking forward to a lot of fun with that one. And there'll be a lot other cameos that I'm going to stick there as well. Try to get almost everybody you could possibly imagine in this Jane Austen universe will make an appearance at least in one novel. And those that didn't make an appearance in any of the others is going to show up in this one. So that, in a nutshell, is what the Jane Austen universe is all about. So let's take a look here at some of the questions that you've popped up in here. I gotta wear these glasses so I can actually read these things. Let's see. Well, yeah, I'll be glad to talk to you, Benny, because I do need somebody who can actually do a couple of these books. There may be another one that I haven't talked to you about that might be interesting to talk to you about. So I appreciate that. Yeah, those of you who are in love with Wentworth, I am too. And I guess my take on Wentworth is that he's a little bit like Darcy, and yet he's not. Darcy, I see Darcy as a very reserved person. He feels very, very deeply, but it's hard for it to come out. He basically shows his love by his actions. So he's not the type of person that could pour out a letter like Frederick Wentworth. So he's far more emotional, though as a captain of a warship, he has to try to keep those thoughts inside. And in fact, in some ways, if anyone you will read the book, you'll see that Wentworth is really two men. You have Frederick Wentworth, who loves Anne so much that he's burned for her for 8 years. He might have been jealous. He definitely has a strong jealousy streak, but he adores this woman. But at the same time, he is the captain of a warship. His word is law. Nobody can question the captain of a warship. Anne's issue is she has to figure out, which person am I talking to? Am I talking to Frederick, or am I talking to Captain Wentworth? So there's going to be some issues aboard the honeymoon cruise as their marriage begins their shakedown cruise. What we got here? Yeah, Agnes here asks, how do I decide which characters are worth redeeming and which ones not? I look at what their actions were as Austen wrote them. I do try to stay with the personalities that Austen created in her books. And that's something that's very, very important to me. So there's been a lot of controversy for the few people who don't like the three colonels. It's because they get this idea that Carolyn Bingley is completely unredeemable. And I reject that utterly. I believe she's very redeemable. In fact, I guess as an American, I see Carolyn as being the most American character that Austen ever wrote. She is a person who's trying to rise up from the sphere for which she is born, trying to join a higher society. She just does it very, very badly. She does love her brother. She loves herself more, but she does love her brother. And that's why she eventually does support Jane, because she wants to make her brother happy. Of course, yeah, she wants to be a person that's in the first circles. Well, here's a handsome, rich guy. Marry him. Hey, I'm in. Of course, she doesn't really realize that Darcy really has no interest in it. And part of it's Darcy's fault because he's so reserved. He doesn't really make it that clear that the gal doesn't have a chance. So the way I redeem her is she meets her fellow soul, another person who's looking to redeem his character, and that's Colonel Sir John Beaufort. And so that's the way I redeemed her. Tilney is another person that I don't think is as bad as some of the adaptations have put out. Just like Henry and Eleanor, he was raised by a tyrannical father. And he is far more under his thumb than either his brother and sister because he's the heir. He's the one who's in the military. And the general still has influence on his career. So I see him acting out because he is under his father's thumb. And so the way I redeem him is he starts losing all his friends. He's at the bottom. He meets this beautiful girl who's in love with him, but the parents are going to put up with his nonsense. And that's, of course, going to be Sir Percy Blakeney. And in a way, in the book, I'm not giving too much away, Sir Percy is going to be that father figure that Frederick's always been looking for. And that's what helps redeem him, become the man that he can be, to make him worthy to stand next to the Pimpernel as he once again faces evil in Paris. So that's why I have fun with them. I just love doing that. There are two characters that are, well, actually, I can think of several, but I can think of two that are completely unredeemable. One of them is John Willoughby. John Willoughby is unredeemable because of what he did to the woman that Colonel Brandon loved, that was mistreated by the daughter of the man of her, which is his ward, Elizabeth. And for him to seduce her and leave her and not take responsibility for his illegitimate child, and only way that he would be able to meet his responsibilities is to lose a duel with Brandon, shows me the type of guy he is. He is also romancing Marianne with the hopes that his aunt would eventually die, so he'll be able to really have some bucks, and maybe he can afford to have a young gal like Marianne in his arm. But when She refuses to die, and his aunt gives him an ultimatum. He folds like a deck of cards, marries Sophia Gray, who also has some money, doesn't love her, but he's all set. And yet he has the audacity to show up and say, "What poor, pitiful me." Oh, get lost. I'm a guy. I ain't buying it. But the guy that is probably worse is, as I call him, Ponscom. There's nothing good about Henry Crawford. I'm sorry. He may have fallen in love with Fanny because she is so good. She almost radiates goodness. But he's scum. He is absolute scum. He was playing three girls against each other, got caught up with actually having some feelings for one. But boy, once Mariah says, "Hey, come on, I hate my husband. Let's have an affair." Boom, he's right there. Trash, absolute trash. So that's why I look at it. People can disagree with that. It's all my personality, but this is where I look at it from a guy's point of view. I ain't buying either one of their excuses. So that's how I pick the ones I like and the ones I don't. Okay, Colonel Brandon. I think Colonel Brandon is one of my favorite people in all of Austen's universe, all her genre. The guy is probably, everybody talks about how Tilney and Wentworth are so romantic. In some ways, Brandon's got them all beat. Brandon loves Marianne and truly wishes the best for her the entire time he knows her. He, to me, he's the real romantic guy, and everything he does proves that. And he is willing to. Well, I think a lot of people who haven't read Sense and Sensibility are only basing it on the adaptations, is they forget that his courtship of Marianne after the events of Sense and Sensibility was 2 years. So you think about the time that he invested in her, waiting till she was ready for him, says a lot for the guy. I think he's fantastic, and because of that, he, as much as anybody, is the true hero and the star of the three colonels. I just love the guy. He's fantastic. I wish I could write more about him, but he's amazing. Let's see what else we got here. Willoughby, yeah, yeah. Willoughby. It asked about why do you think Austen makes Eleanor and softens, because I don't think she does. I think that she believes Willoughby when he comes out there in the middle of the night, worrying that Marianne is dying, at his true emotion. I think he is very sorry, but I think he's sorry for a more selfish reason. He loved her, but he still hurt her. And it's not my fault. It's Sophia's fault. She made me write that terrible letter. It's rather interesting that some Austen fans can forgive Bingley for being a wimp, being guided by his sisters, but they Bingley does it, but it's okay. But his sisters are rotten. But they completely forgive Willoughby for being bullied by his aunt and being bullied by, I guess you would say, his new bride. But you got to see it from Sophia's standpoint. Here is this girl sending you letters and everything, and you're supposed to marry me? I ain't putting up with that. You get rid of this. You just cut this stuff out. You're going to marry me. This is how the cow ate the cabbage. And the wimp, instead of establishing that, no, that's not what I want, no, I'll do it. I'll do it, honey. And if you remember how the book ends, Willoughby is perfectly happy raising his dogs and dealing with his sport, and living probably as much a separate life from his wife as he can put up with. So Willoughby does not really suffer. He may think, oh, yeah, be nice. You know, Mary Ann's really cute. But then, yep, I got another shooting party to go to. Yeah, I got no use for Willoughby. Uh, yeah, you're right. Eleanor does not let Willoughby off the hook. This is another reason about heroines. I wish I could write more about Eleanor, but the way she ends up, it just, hey, happy after. What can you do? But Eleanor, that's why I tell people I didn't marry Elizabeth Bennet. I married Eleanor Dashwood. My wife is Eleanor, and I'm happy for it because she's strong, she's quiet, she's got what guys would say she has guts. There's something to her. I respect the heck out of her. She is possibly, if not the strongest woman that that was written by Austen. So I think it's great. I think it's great. Yeah, you're not really an Elizabeth fan, are you? No, that's not true. If you're talking about Elizabeth Bennet, yes, I am. I like Elizabeth, but I don't let her off the hook. I'm glad you kind of brought that up because it's an argument with me on whether or not who's the one who has pride and which one who has prejudice in Pride and Prejudice. And before I say that, I want everybody to remember Pride and Prejudice is basically written through the viewpoint of Elizabeth. Except for a couple of very, very minor scenes, you really don't know what Darcy's thinking. Only what Elizabeth sees Darcy thinking. So you have to look at not only what Elizabeth says, but what Elizabeth does. And to me, Pride and Prejudice is not only a great comedy and a great book, and it's a one that everybody ought to read. To me, the story of Pride and Prejudice is the growth of Elizabeth, where she starts out as this smart aleckly, bright Elizabeth Bennet, and by the end of the novel, she becomes a woman who is no longer Elizabeth Bennet. She is now Elizabeth Darcy. And that is a woman you got to watch out for. That is a person that you can truly respect. You notice she becomes quieter as the book goes on. She becomes more thoughtful. She saves that biting wit for the people who need it, like Lady Catherine and like George. Don't get old. You're Wickham. So that is fascinating. And some of the adaptations miss that. They miss her growth. One of the things that I think they got right in the 1995 one was that the director made Elizabeth young. They gave her an excuse for getting so bent out of shape just because somebody didn't want to dance with her. Yeah, she overheard what Darcy says, and there's arguments between Abigail and I disagree on whether or not she was meant to hear that comment or not. And that's fine. But you have to remember that she really took that pretty seriously, and then she held on to it and instantly believed a practiced liar, hook, line, and sinker. This woman who's bright, intelligent, taught to always think about what's being told you, she falls like a rock for Wickham's tales. So it's because her feelings were hurt. And that's where her prejudice draws from. But it's also her pride in taking a step back and thinking, Bingley likes him. I mean, and he really does. And then he also see how he waits upon his completely awful aunt, how he makes these very stumbling but very subtle ways of protecting her when she's in company with her. She doesn't see the compliment that's being paid when he's always calling upon her or running into her in the woods. It's not because she's not intelligent. It's because her pride and her prejudice is so firmly in place, she can't see what's in front of her until the scene at the parsonage during the disastrous proposal, probably the worst proposal in the history of literature. And she was right to turn him down. I mean, if it was by my sister, I'd know I'd turn him down to kick his butt. But the letter is like her mind is open, her eyes are open, and to me, that's one of the most fascinating parts of the book, where you read that passage from that point to where she shows up at Pemberley. You can see her change, where she says, "Yeah, I've always seen my father with pain," but she didn't really. Now she has to deal with it. Now she has to deal that her mother's not the brightest bulb, but she loves her daughters. Dad just sits there like a lump. He hides in his study reading, and Elizabeth's his favorite because Elizabeth will sit there and make fun of his neighbors. So the only time he ever stands up and becomes somebody you can respect is when he backs her to not marry Collins. Other than that, there isn't a whole bunch you can really respect Mr. Bennet for. And it's during this section of the novel where you see her growth that she then becomes a woman that you can respect. And so that's frankly my favorite part of the book. So that's the way I look at it. Now, you want to talk about Darcy, you can make a lot of assumptions about Darcy, which is the fun part of being an author. You can actually do that. But again, you have to still look at what Austen wrote, and you have to look at his actions. And you look at how he is generous really throughout the whole book. And he doesn't really change that all bunch, except he becomes a little less reserved. He claims he made this great change and great alteration in his person. I don't quite buy that either, except that he does become more vocal, less reserved, especially with people who are of a lesser station than he is. But he's still a person who's an awful person to hang around on a Sunday evening with nothing to do. But he is absolutely loyal, absolutely generous, absolutely the best master that you could possibly have if you lived in that type of time period. So, I like Elizabeth, but she's a number two. Eleanor is definitely number one when you talk to me about Austen's heroines. And what else we got here? Let's see. Yeah, Elizabeth does have to overcome a lot of those errors and everything else. So we got about 15 more minutes. Are there any questions out there that are coming from the YouTube? Whoever's covering that. Let me see if I can pull that sucker up here over here. Let's see what we got here. Any questions? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Let's see. In Mansfield, since the third daughters. Okay. Right. Well, if you come about third daughters and you want to talk about Mary, I like Mary. Yeah.
Sorry, give me a second here. I've muted my computer.
Okay.
Okay. Not so much questions. We've been talking about a bit about younger daughters, older daughters. We agree that Crawford is awful and Willoughby too. Thinking about, sorry, I'm just going through trying to find them here. Again, you've got the sort of alone and eldest daughters, Eleanor and Jane, who have a lot in common, strengths and there's sort of special ways, and it being the younger daughters who really get to run wild a bit. So yeah, we've been enjoying it.
That might be a theme in Austen's work, because you kind of see that Marianne is far more emotional and far more running around than Eleanor. Of course, you have the Bennet girls. You look at Emma; she's younger than Isabella, and she's the one who's kind of of course she's running everything at home, but she's she's being Emma. And then of course you have the Morelands, the huge family of 10. I don't know if she's the oldest daughter or not, but it's rather interesting about that. So maybe that was a theme that Austen had about older girls, that
Yeah.
that yeah, they had responsibilities, they did thing, and the younger ones just kind of, you started losing interest in them, and they just kind of
Yeah.
did what
That's
they wanted to
it's
do.
a bit messed around in Persuasion, of course, where Anne Elliot is the one who's responsible.
Right.
So yeah, and then I thought about weak mothers who really let their younger girls in particular get away with things, or fathers.
Yeah, that seems to
Persuasion.
be a theme throughout there,
Oh,
except for
yeah,
Northanger Abbey, is with
yeah.
her strongest mother and father. Though I have a real soft spot for, in Mansfield Park, uh, uh, Bertram, Sir Thomas Bertram. I've argued before in a post that I think he's the best father she ever wrote. That
Mm,
because he tries to do well, but he's tied by his own station. He sees his mistakes and he corrects them as much as
yeah.
he can. And to me, that's the sign of a great father. And very few of any of the other fathers that she wrote about can or are willing to do that.
Mm.
Which is rather, I mean, the ones that you actually wrote, not the ones they referred to, like George Darcy or Mr. Dashwood, and the ones who pass away before we actually meet them. So, but before I get anywhere else, I have to put kudos to three people. I couldn't do what I do now without my editors. And Debbie Stein, Ellen Pickens, and my wife are the reason that my books read at all. I depend upon them. They are fantastic, and I love them all. So, ladies, thank you so much. So, any other things we can bring up? I do have other books, of course, out here. I have my New Orleans Modern. People talk about writing books in a modern, and it was probably the best way I could actually do anything with Emma. Is I took Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and Emma, and put them in modern day New Orleans, and that's my Crescent City series. If y'all like moderns, give it a shot. It's I really enjoy doing it. This is my Plains of Chalmette. It's kind of Austen-esque in that the two major uh, combatants, characters in the book, are Matthew Darcy, an American officer who is a distant relative of the Darcys of Pemberley, and Major Matthew, I'm sorry, Major James Fitzwilliam, who is a son and a brother of Colonel Fitzwilliam, but he's kind of been disowned by the Fitzwilliam family for marrying well below his station. So through their eyes, you get to see not only New Orleans as it was in 1814, but also the importance of the event that was the Battle of New Orleans. Not all my stuff is that serious. My Western take on Pride and Prejudice, my first novel that I've had published, which is Pemberley Ranch. And this was really a fun book to take the basic characters, not somewhat of the plot of Pride and Prejudice, and move it from 1811 England to 1871 West Texas. That's right, I turned Darcy into a cowboy. And then my two farces, The Companion of His Future Life, which takes the idea of Mr. Collins marrying Mary Bennet instead of Charlotte Lucas. And someone mentioned that some people like and some people hate the idea of taking Austen's words and putting them into different people's mouths. Well, that's the whole point of this book, is I do this throughout the novel. It changes the meaning of the words which I find is hilarious. But then that's my sense of humor. But yeah, this was a lot of fun. And my farce, Mr. Darcy comes to dinner. I can sum it up in one word. Darcy breaks his leg and he's stuck in longboard.
Jack,
Yes.
there is a question from Nicola throwing in Edmund Bertram. What do you think about him as a guy? If we've got time.
Edmund Bertram, not much if you look at him as a real person. But the thing about me, I have a very interesting thought of what Mansfield Park is. I look at Mansfield Park as an allegorical novel about good and evil, about staying true to yourself and resisting temptation, and you will be rewarded if you do so. Of course, Fanny Price is the ultimate character in that. She is put through hell, but she stays true to her principles, true to the person that she is, and at the end, she is rewarded. Now, you can say that, Edmund, that's a reward, but in a way, he is also the male version of her. He is also tested by temptation, and temptation is represented by the Crawfords. Crawfords are temptation. They are worldliness. They are people who do not believe in morals. They believe in their emotions. They believe in ease. They believe in whatever is happening now, what makes me feel good, who cares? We can get by. She wants to change him, mold him into something he has no desire to be. He is one of the few people in Austen's universe who really wants to be a priest. He wants to serve his community. He wants to wear the cloth. He wants to preach the gospel. And she's trying to stop him from doing that. The person who backs him most on what he wants to do with his life is Fanny. And both of them get what they want, and they get it together as a married couple. I'm not saying they have great passion and great love like you would see with the other Austen couples, but he is far more tempted than she is, but both of them eventually meet the destiny that they wish for, and they are rewarded. And that's the way I look at Mansfield Park. If you look at it as a straight novel, it's hard to get excited about either one of them. But when you look at, I think, as an allegorical novel, I think it's magnificent. I really do.
I've got one more question from YouTube.
Yep.
Paige Hale wrote, I wonder, after writing so long, whether any of you struggle to craft original plots that avoid the common tropes, compromise, forced marriage, and so on.
That's a good question. The history part helps me, and that's where I've been able to do that. But that's also why the Jane Austen Fighting Men's universe is coming to an end. There's only so many tales I can write about these characters in that place I stuck them. Once you get past Rosings Park, which is going to be coming out. So what I have to do is start branching out and start thinking of original plots. Some of that's not necessarily going to be in Regency England. Some of the novels I've been considering to write in the future, yeah, it's going to be a forced marriage scenario as well, but different than what most people write. A lot of people write a forced marriage scenario and they keep Darcy and Elizabeth basically living separate lives until they fall in love and come there toward the end. I'm not doing that. It's going to be very different. So that kind of part of it, because what I like is once you get Darcy and Elizabeth together, they become an unbeatable team. And so if I write this novel, that's what's going to happen. There are going to be forces that are going to be coming upon them, forces that might be overwhelming, except that they're together and they work as a team. And through their teamwork and friendship, they will become in love. Now, they may have been lovers before then. After all, they are married, but you'll be able to see the growth of them becoming a unit, and because that's where I see the Darcys are, the Regency power couple. So if I write that book, that's what's gonna be. I'm probably going to write some more books in the Crescent City universe because there's so much of Louisiana history that is interesting. The toughest one would be to write a Civil War series, and I think we can kind of understand that. But the Civil War in Louisiana was so weird and so different than any other part of the United States that I really want to write that book. There's two other novels in the series that I would like to write. People are not aware of just how devastating yellow fever was to Louisiana. In the history of this state, more people have died from yellow fever than from any other cause, including warfare. We were ground zero for yellow fever. And we were also very much involved in the battle against yellow fever with, and so that would be a turn of the century around 1900, in the years coming up there, working with Walter Reed and others in combating what was causing yellow fever, the verification it was insect-borne disease and what was required to basically to eliminate it. And then a war about World War II. I'm sorry, wars kind of come up because that's where history happens. But what we found out recently was that during World War II, the British had a real problem with parachuting people to work with the French resistance. They all learned how to speak French either in England or in Canada, which means they sounded like they came from Paris. You're out in the countryside, you're going to stick out like a New Yorker in the middle of Wyoming. They found out that while Cajun French is a different dialect than French, the accent was much like what you found in the countryside. So they had a unit of Cajun men they found them during boot camp. And they were assigned, first, learn to speak a little bit more proper French, but keep the accent. So they could work behind the lines and communicate with the French resistance during the war. So I'm learning more about that, but that's a fascinating book that I really want to bring out there and to talk about that. And so that's just an amazing thing. And now we are out of time. We have run in there. So before I hand it off, let me get on over to the participants on who's next. I just want to remind y'all of something. It takes a real man to write historical romance. So let me tell you a story. And with that, I believe, who's next here? Is that you, Joanne?
It is.